Welcome to the Nickolas Natali Show. Today on the podcast, guest Luke Rodriguez, valedictorian, presidential scholar. He had a full ride at CSUF. He's a distinguished scholar at UCLA Law School, also a full ride. Nationally ranked 5th place for mock trial and UCLA finalist in the court competition. He's a law clerk for the Orange County Public Defender's Office. This week's riddle, how does a penguin build its house? Tune into the end of the episode and you can find out. Head on over to nickolasnatali.com/shop. Get yourself a sweatshirt, a polo, anything you want. It's probably there. On youtube.com/Nickolas Natali, there's new videos every Monday, and always leave a 5-star review. You can become the reviewer of the week, trying to get to 100 5-star reviews and fast. As always, this episode is sponsored by Little Webby LLC at littlewebby.com. Creates the best darn custom software, websites, and mobile applications. Follow them on Instagram at Little Webby LLC. DM them and say we sent you for a free 30-minute consultation. As always, I'm the intern. You're the listener. This is Nick.
Hello and welcome. This is the Nickolas Natali Show. I'm your host, Nickolas Natali. Today we have a very special guest, Luke Rodriguez. Season's greetings.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So excited to have you. We're going to dive right into it. We're talking the political side of everything that's going on in 2020, and we're going to start with the race issues in America. So the first question is systematic racism real?
You know, as a white guy, I got to be careful how I answer this, but no, I think so. I think it does exist, and but I think it's a little bit more complicated than how people think about it. So the way I often think about systemic racism is when you have over 200 years of ingrained explicit racism, whether it's through slavery, whether it's through Jim Crow, and a little bit more implicitly through the war on drugs. It's almost like the equivalent of beating somebody up and then saying, all right, let's run a marathon. There's nothing holding you back now. Well, there are certain things that end up pulling people back. So if you have things like redlining, like Jim Crow, you have a situation today where the average African-American family's net worth is like 10% of the average white family's net worth. So all of those issues create I think it's hard for people to understand it because you have almost systemic racism without that many racists left in the system. So it's almost like a residual effects of past injustices.
You hit something that's hits very close to home for me. A lot of people don't understand it. And I will be honest, like the more research that I'm doing, the more I'm getting kind of confused on where it lies within the system. Like your analogy is spot on with, you know, we have all of this turmoil on the back end, and now how do you keep running? But let's talk about some of the issues of, like, let's say redlining, for example. Like,
right.
How does that affect an African American community?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, redlining was, you know, basically like from the 1960s to the 1980s, banks systematically denied loans to a lot of black families. And so what it did is it created a lot less black ownership, and home ownership is one of the biggest assets of most middle-class families. So, and a lot of homes tend to get passed on to past generations, and they either sell them or keep them, but that wealth stays in the family one way or another. So if you have a situation where they're not able to build wealth through home equity, through home ownership, it's going to have effects several generations down. And you combine that with, because communities to this day are still very segregated. Obviously, it's not ingrained in the law like it used to be. But again, if for decades or even centuries, you have required housing segregation, these communities kind of just become segregated and they never really get integrated. So that is another example of something that still was an injustice in the past that still has an effect today.
Definitely. I've heard another, I don't want to say counter argument, but I'd be curious on your thoughts on this. I'm trying to figure out which way to take it. The first being, they're saying a lot of the, like, as you mentioned, like white families' income compared to an African-American family's income, they're saying that the majority of that difference is based on whether somebody has grown up in a 2-parent household versus a single-parent household. And they're saying that the African-American community has, like, from, I think, 1960s, it was like around 20%. It was a single-parent household, and then now it's close to 80 or something like that. And they're saying that is also part of the reason why this is the way things are.
I don't think they're entirely wrong. I think it's partially explains it. So that doesn't exactly explain the issues of total net wealth of a family. But on the issues of like income, there's no doubt that one parent versus two parent households has a tremendous effect on future success. I think the question becomes, well, why are there so many single parent households in the Black community? And again, that's something that you can look back at something like the war on drugs, and the average sentence for crack cocaine versus the average sentence for powder cocaine. Powder cocaine was predominantly used by white people in the suburbs, and crack cocaine predominantly used in the inner cities. Crack cocaine had 100 times lengthier sentence for the exact same amount of drugs. So, the white male gets, a slap on the wrist, and the Black dad gets 50 years in prison. And again, this isn't an only explanation, but this is just an example of like a not necessarily even explicitly racist and almost unintentionally racist law that has a continuing effect on Black inequality. Because again, if you have all these Black fathers going to prison 30, 40 years ago, well, then you have kids raised by one parent, and then they're more likely to raise kids with only one parent. And so it kind of just becomes a vicious cycle that becomes very difficult to get out of. So like I said, it's this really complicated problem because you have, I think, systemic racism without many racists in the system.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to put it. Then let's take it to still on the different incomes, and now how those incomes, like with property tax funding schools, and how since the incomes are different in the different sort of communities, you obviously get different types of resources. Some gets more and some gets less. Does that play into the whole cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. This isn't true of every state. California tends to have a lot more equitable funding of schools, but one of the most glaring examples is Connecticut. And there's a city called Hartford, which is mostly minority, really low income, and the average expenditure per pupil is just so drastically lower than the higher income neighborhoods. And again, there's a lot of possible solutions to it. Some that conservatives might really like, some that liberals might really like. Conservatives might be in favor of like a sort of voucher system to allow minority students to go to private schools, and then you can maybe figure out a way to better integrate those schools as a result. A program that maybe liberals might favor more is figuring out a way to better integrate communities, because the problem is that one, like I said, it's tied with, or like you said, it's tied with property tax. But two, a lot of these schools become de facto segregated based off both racial lines and based off socioeconomic lines. So there's a lot of scholarship that talks about one way to close the white-Black achievement gap is by having better integrated communities. That way the same opportunities are available, the same school options are available, and that could go a long way in closing some of these gaps.
How would you suggest doing something like that? Because then I would almost imagine there's so much social aspect of like, because I do think that people tend to, what's the right term, drift or be attracted toward those that have similar qualities to them. And there's no doubt about that. But how do you can't force integration either. Like, of course.
And right. And this is where you have to get sort of creative with the solutions. Like I said, I mean, there might be this sort of drifting you mentioned. I think it's also, too, a product of how segregated communities were 30, 40 years ago. I mean, you can read stories about in the 70s, a Black family moving into an all-white neighborhood and it resulting in mass protests. Again, like that, if I talk about houses being passed on generations, it makes sense that that's going to still have an effect today. So in terms of what you can do today, again, there's not a single easy solution. I think there's like a set of possible solutions. One that's been proposed is to just have more vigorously enforce fair housing laws. And the way you do that is by having more housing testers. So what they'll do is they'll have somebody who's usually a government employee who's white with similar traits, similar income, try to attempt to purchase a home versus somebody who's African American. And I mean, the results are sometimes shocking. I mean, they'll find instances of discrimination. So if you basically have more people doing fair housing testing, that's one way to do it. As we sort of talked about with loan discrimination, that's another problem where to this day, there's still issues with Black people of similar incomes not getting the mortgage loan. So if you have people who, again, are doing like almost like lending testing, similar to how you did with fair housing laws, I think that's another possible solution. There's other solutions out there that are a little bit more controversial, that require a little bit more government force, like almost like a housing voucher to better integrate communities. I don't know if those are the right answers, but I think the first two, though, you'd probably get a lot less pushback on.
Yeah, it's almost like accountability, because when I first heard of the banks refusing loans based on people's skin, I was kind of like, this almost seems like individual in a way, you know, like one off, this one bank could be racist and this other bank couldn't. So like tracking those down and an entire system would be difficult. But kind of what you're saying, holding people accountable, that's way different.
I'll give you one more example, and this one is probably a little bit more controversial. But the way that communities are zoned arguably contributes to the housing segregation as well. So if you have now, I'm not necessarily against having suburban areas or single family zoned areas, but if you have a school district that is solely made up of single family home zoned areas, then you're pushing out anybody of lower socioeconomic status. So again, it's not to abolish single family housing, but to make sure that school districts also include multifamily housing, apartments, condos, that sort of thing, that's more likely to have maybe lower middle class people and better racially and socioeconomically integrate communities.
Do you think there's going to be some point where, let me rephrase this, do you think there's any sort of classism in the United States then?
Oh, of course. I mean, just based off of, I live in Westwood, or at least used to live in Westwood before coronavirus. I mean, my rent was, no middle class person could afford it. So, just based off, I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that's just, there's certain more desirable locations that, that have more demand. But if you have a situation where that really desirable location is only single family homes, then it's impossible for anybody other than somebody who's super wealthy from affording it. So, you just want to make sure that those areas also are zoned for some multifamily housing.
Right. So it's like there's got to be some sort of line, because I feel like capitalism in general is like the beauty of you can earn as however much you want. But so at the same time, we have all these issues with low income not receiving enough resources, and that is detrimental for generations to come.
Well, to clarify something, this isn't even necessarily about resources. I mean, this is a government imposed problem. I mean, this is, I would dispute even a product of capitalism. I mean, this is government regulation, zoning that zones certain areas as exclusively single family homes. So it's a government created problem. And so you can have a very easy government created solution by just having less government regulation.
Oh, yeah. So you're saying that there's particular zones that people, like, if you're a single family, you have to, or you don't have to, but like only those homes together. And that is almost limiting people's freedom to choose where they want to live in a sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. And again, like I said, it's not a problem to have neighborhoods that are single family zoned areas. It's just when it becomes an entire town or entire city.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm picking up the steam here. Interesting. So let's keep it moving with, like, I want to stick on the topic of race issues. Do you see how any of the political parties are trying to use these race issues to their advantage?
Well, yes. So you have a situation where really since the 1940s, 1950s, African Americans have voted overwhelmingly Democrat. And so I think that the way that the Republicans have recently, at least particularly in this election cycle, have tried to diminish that, right? Because if an ethnic group that makes up 13% of the country is voting against you by over 90%, it vastly diminishes your ability to there's a lot of background noise on your end.
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
Uh-oh. It could be me roughing this thing up.
Okay.
If it persists, let me know, and we'll cut and figure it out.
Anyway, so something that Trump has done, which is actually pretty smart, is he's been running a lot of criticism of Joe Biden for some of his past votes on the legislation I mentioned earlier that produced the war on drugs, that produced some of the disparate treatment of African Americans. And so what that does, it might not necessarily earn him votes, but it might sort of depress the turnout. Whereas I think on the Democratic Party side, they've come to this realization after 2016 that they can't take the African American vote for granted. That was a big mistake on Hillary Clinton's part. And so I think they've realized that they have to give real, tangible, at least promise real tangible change for the African American community. And I think that's why there's a really strong likelihood why Joe Biden will have an African American woman as his VP. And I don't necessarily see that as identity politics. I see that as coalition politics. I mean, there's a constituency that saved him in the primary, and so in order to boost turnout, it might make sense to pick an African American woman.
Yeah. Here's this. I almost feel like this is almost conspiracy theory-esque, but the fact that it almost seems like race issues come up around election, around the election time. Do you think there's any sort of engineering in that?
I actually disagree, because if you think about the Ferguson riots, if you think about the Eric Garner, the protests after Eric Garner, after Trayvon Martin, I mean, that was about 2013, 2014. So not really certainly not during a presidential election year. So, I mean, I don't want to completely dismiss the point, but I've seen enough of it happen during not an election year to not fully buy into that.
Okay. Well, I'm also trying to say, like, do you think politics are like working behind the scenes in any of these things? Kind of what we keep seeing, which I also, trying to understand the validity of, like, the police planting bricks. Like, I'm more so concerned about, like, the intention of, like, any sort of politics that are tending to stir up something in order to receive, like, better gain down the road. It's not necessarily the year in general, but, like, politics being involved in that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I feel I don't want to dabble into any of the conspiracies of it. I just don't know.
That's fair enough. So, with the 2020 election coming up, what are your pros and cons on each of the candidates running?
Oh, that's interesting. So with Trump, look, I probably share a lot more policy views with Trump than I do with Biden, in terms of, like, I strongly supported Trump's Supreme Court justices. I think Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh have been fantastic Supreme Court justices, and I probably agree with him on some of the regulatory stuff. The cons is I think he's a maniac. I think he's completely unfit for office. I voted in the Republican primaries in 2016, and I just couldn't vote for Trump in 2016. But I left the possibility open that he could earn my vote in 2020. He's done nothing to earn my vote, and he sort of confirmed a lot of my fears. One, that he has turned the Republican Party into a cult of personality, where the number one issue for 80% of Republican primary voters is a candidate's loyalty to Donald Trump. You just saw Jeff Sessions, one of the most conservative senators, 5 years ago. He was the first person to endorse Trump. They had a falling out when he was Attorney General, and just tonight he lost his primary for the Alabama Senate race. So that has been disturbing. And I think to some extent Trump has sort of radicalized the left. I mean, there seems to be a sort of myth among a lot of people on the left that, like, racism has gotten worse over the past few years. I think that's definitely not true. But when Trump says some racially inflammatory things, it's kind of hard to not understand why they think that. So I think to a lot of extent, he's sort of the epitome of everything that Republicans said, no, we're not. Like, we don't say sexist things. We don't say racially inflammatory things. He does all that. And so I think he's really radicalized the left in a lot of really negative ways. So those are all the cons on him. With respect to Biden, look, I think the pro is that he's not most of the other Democrats. I mean, it could have been a Bernie Sanders. It could have been an Elizabeth Warren. It could have been one of these sort of more fringe, especially Bernie, I would say, is truly fringe. Warren, maybe a little bit more debatable if she's fringe. I think that to a lot of people who are independent to right-leaning independent, who maybe really reluctantly voted for Trump in 2016, who looked and disliked both candidates in 2016 and voted for Trump, which the overwhelming number of people who disliked both candidates in 2016 voted for Trump. And the numbers are, like, completely reversed in 2020. So I think he sort of presents more centrist return to normalcy to a lot of conservatives who are uncomfortable with Trump. So that's, I think, the big pro. He's not going to, Trump keeps on saying it's sleepy Joe Biden, but also this, like, anarchist communist Joe Biden. Well, he's either sleepy or he's Stalin, and I doubt he's both. I think the cons to Biden, one, he's not a particularly exciting candidate. But Trump is just such a, Biden might not mobilize people, but Trump might mobilize so many Democrats to vote against him that it might not matter that Biden is particularly exciting. Right. Personal issue I have with Biden is I think that he is trying, after just totally romping the socialist in the primary. He's really afraid of a lot of them staying home, so he's making overtures, kind of pandering to them. Will that pan out in policy with him having a much more left-wing presidency than he campaigned on in the primary? I don't know. I hope not, but we'll see.
Well, I think you're forgetting a big one too, Kanye West. Do you mention him? Do
Oh.
you mention him anywhere in the candidates?
I don't
He's not
know.
official yet, right?
I don't think he will be official at all. So Kanye made the tweet that he was going to run for president. I think a couple of days ago, his family released some statement saying they were very concerned about him. They think he was having a bipolar episode. I mean, look, in order to get on the ballot, he has to get a pretty significant number of signatures, which is especially difficult with COVID. I think the chances of him actually being anything more than a writing candidate are virtually zero.
Yeah, and he's so late in the game that I feel like
Right.
it's too much.
No, I just think for so many people, look, neither Trump or Hillary Clinton got even close to 50% of the vote in 2016, which means a lot of people voted third party. I mean, I think, about 6% of the country who voted in 2016 voted third party. And I think a lot of people regret voting third party, or they're going to be too cautious about, or maybe some conservatives who didn't vote for Trump, he turned out to be better in their minds, and so I think for a lot more people, it's much more of a binary choice. So I can't see some like Kanye West really playing much of a spoiler beyond maybe 0.5% of the population.
Yeah, writing him in. Is there any part of you that's concerned about Joe Biden and his health? Like a lot of people keep mentioning dementia. Like are these real concerns that we should actually be taking into consideration here?
I don't think so. I think they merit about the same level of concern as, there was this ad that went out about Trump struggling to go down a ramp and struggling to hold water for a second.
Yeah,
I thought it was overall
true.
an absurd criticism. I think you can take either with Trump or Biden, who are not particularly good public speakers. I think they're both the debates are going to be just a bunch of word salad. They're not particularly great speakers, but you can take any slice out and try to, I'll give you a great example. One that I saw circulating was just a clip of Joe Biden saying, "I'm going to beat Joe Biden." He's actually saying, "I'm going to," but what it actually, if you listen to the few seconds before, he was asked something along the lines of, "How are you going to appeal to people who supported Bernie or supported Elizabeth Warren? Are you going to change your message?" And his response was, "No, I'm going to beat Joe Biden." But if you just listen to isolation, people heard, "I'm going to beat Joe Biden." I'll give you one more example. There was when his speech Super Tuesday night, after he had a really decisive win on Super Tuesday. He's walking up a ramp, and his wife is on one side, his sister's on another. And as they're walking up, they kind of switch, and they're behind him. And he grabs, as he's speaking, he doesn't see that they switched. He grabs one of their hands, and then he referred to I think it was his wife as his sister, or maybe it was the other way around. And everybody's like, "Oh my God, he's confusing, his wife and his sister." And it's like, well, a 3-second excerpt that kind of looks like that. But I think, there was a lot of, especially on the Bernie side, a lot of expectation that he would just totally flop during the debate, one-on-one debate with Bernie. And it just didn't pan out. And I actually think it might be a mistake, a really big mistake for the Trump campaign to put in all the stock in this idea that Biden is senile, because even if he just does moderately okay, and like I said, he's not a good debater, if he just does moderately okay in the debate, he'll vastly exceed expectations. So, and it might be a little insulting to, Trump, who did quite well with voters over the age of 65 in 2016, he's now trailing them by like 10 points. And I don't know, maybe the attacks on Biden, they don't particularly like. I don't know.
I feel like with most debates that I've seen, and trust me, it's not a high number of debates, it tends to always lead toward name calling back and forth. Is that the nature of politics? Is that something we should expect, or should we want from a candidate that's going to be more solution oriented instead of like, "You suck and I'm better than you,"
That obviously that's definitely what you want. I think what you have in this election and what you had in 2016 as well was neither candidate, more so in 2016, but certainly to an extent in 2020, neither candidate is particularly well liked or particularly popular. And so it's much easier to try to scare the heck out of people about the other candidate, try to package that person as unpalpable as possible, rather than to try to win on your own merit. So, I think that's unfortunate. I don't think it's as big of a problem in elections in general. But given the nature of the candidates, you definitely see it more the last election cycle and this election cycle.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Kind of what you're saying with the word salad to come. That's
right.
like
no, the debates are assuming the debates happen, I don't know. Maybe somebody will back down, but assuming the debates happen, they're going to probably be pretty cringy to listen to.
Yeah, I agree. So this question was written in, and Aaron asks, should we get rid of the two-party system? Do you think it's working?
No. I think that the United States having a parliamentary system would probably end up being worse. I think you would get some very strange factions. So imagine, I don't imagine that the percentage of people in this country that are like legit white supremacists is higher than like 3%. But let's say it is 3%, and
That's
in a parliamentary,
high, yeah.
maybe that's way over an estimate. But let's just say it was 3%, or imagine it was like, okay. So in a parliamentary system, all you have to do is get like that percentage of vote, or maybe even less, depending on what your threshold is, to get a number of seats. And then, and this is something that you see in a lot of European countries, you have like these like sort of far right, fringe right, or far left parties that get just enough seats to become relevant and become important. And it just kind of requires a sort of pandering for one part, or for one, to have a coalition, So I think there's just so many fringe groups. You'd certainly have a socialist party. You'd have some like QAnon party. I don't know, some fringe far right party. And I would not want them to be a major political party. I think that the two-party system kind of allows those fringe groups to get swallowed in the broader party, but then tempered, whether it's sort of some of the crazy far right people or some of the socialists on the left.
Extremists on both sides tend to usually freak me out a little bit. It's you gotta think a little bit, like there's got to be some wiggle room somewhere, man. You can't be so diehard with it. But I think that kind of bleeds into this next question of, so the media, I almost feel like, does take on that persona from time to time of like,
right,
okay, I'm a left media source, but I despise the right. They're the enemy. I'm a right media source, and the left is what's wrong with this country.
Sure.
You gotta stop them. What's your
almost
take on
Rachel Maddow versus Tucker Carlson, or
Oh yeah, what is your take on media like that? Like it almost seems divisive and almost negative in a sense.
I think a lot of people like to be told what they already think, and I think that's what people like Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson provide, and they certainly have, maybe more so Tucker Carlson than Rachel Maddow, probably higher viewership than they should. I think that the media in general has a serious bias problem. Look, Trump gives the media a lot of fodder and a lot of reason to give very easy criticism, and I think there's this perception, like a lot of people on the right look at the media and say, well, it's just Trump criticism, and where I think they might have a point is that it almost becomes this obsessive focus on him. And because Trump has sort of personally targeted a lot of these journalists, they've sort of internalized it. And Megyn Kelly made a really important point that when Trump targeted her, she had to work every day, and it was really hard to not make it personal. I think a lot of people have struggled to do that. Now, where I would then also respond and say, after saying you're partially correct to conservatives who don't like how the media has talked about Trump, we've also never had a candidate like start tweeting conspiracy theories that a former congressman is a murderer. And it's, when it happens 7 days in a row, it's kind of hard. What might seem like a sensationalist story, it's kind of hard for the media to just not report that. Or if the president says, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not lose supporters, I mean, that's just like crazy for somebody to say. So of course that's going to get reported on, and of course he's not doing himself any favors necessarily. But there's definitely a leftward slant on the media, and so it sort of creates an alternative, which I think Fox News is actually sort of an important voice to have out there. But then when you have some of the more fringe elements of it, like Tucker Carlson, like Sean Hannity, that just reinforces people's worldview and doesn't really let them get challenged, that's certainly not good. It just kind of creates an echo chamber. Yeah. And again, it's on the left too, to be clear, probably in worse ways.
Well, how do you go about consuming media then? Because this was another question that was written, and it was, somebody wants to know, how do you consume media without being overwhelmed? But I almost want to ask you, how do you consume media with the intention of like not buying into this crazy bias that we're constantly under pressure to receive all day long? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the best way is to, one of my favorite podcasts is this podcast called Left, Right, and Center. And it's exactly what it sounds like. They have a panelist, somebody who's like left to center left, somebody who's center, and somebody who's like center right to right. And they're having a dialogue, and a lot of points get challenged. And I think listening to something like that is just far more enlightening than experience like, listening to Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson, who's just going to reinforce a certain viewpoint that you have and just kind of create a left wing or right wing echo chamber. I think seeking out two of my favorite news media to read are The Atlantic, which is like probably leans a little bit to left, and National Review, which leans a little bit to the right. I think they both have a lot of really thoughtful writers who don't toe any particular party line. So seeking out non-fringe media like Breitbart, and to a lesser extent Fox News and MSNBC, and sort of reading more nuanced pieces, I think is a better way to consume media, but not everybody does that.
I was almost thinking there should be some sort of media outlet that's just boring facts, like delivered in the most disgustingly
arguably
boring
that's
way.
PBS. Arguably that's PBS, but
right. I just want somebody to sit in front of a camera that has monotone, no expression, saying, "On this day, this happened at this." I mean, I'm sure it would do terrible on the ratings, but at least I would be like, okay, at least I can trust this guy to some degree.
But I was just saying, to provide a counterpoint to that, though, even delivering the sort of most straightforward fact, it's, how you present a particular fact can be colored by bias in a particular way. So whether or not you can ever have a fully, truly neutral news network, I'm sort of skeptical.
Yeah, I don't think it can.
And that's okay. I think that's okay. I just think that, you should, like I said, you should do your best to try to put that aside, and maybe too many journalists don't do that. They don't act in good faith.
I don't think so. But I also think, like a consumer, kind of what you're saying, we want to feed ourselves stuff that's going to make us feel good. Like, oh, my opinion's right. Oh, this person agrees with my opinion. This is awesome. And
look, there might even be a place for that. I mean, once in a while, it's good to know that you're not the only one thinking a certain thing, or maybe you have a certain viewpoint and you have somebody articulate it in a way that you hadn't thought of before. And I think there's a place for that. It's just the problem becomes when that's the only media you consume.
Yeah, I agree. I want to circle back to more of the race issue type discussions.
Yeah.
So let's hit reparations. Do you think they're
in
order?
No. So what I've heard some people on the left talk about, and they might have a point, is that I just want the issue to be studied. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I just cannot imagine a proposal that would not create more racial division than already exists. So it's very hard to think about how you would implement it. Would it apply? I mean, because there's a lot of African Americans who were not descendant of slaves, who might, not proportionally, not a lot, but a significant number that have immigrated from African countries. What would would it just be some sort of lump sum payment? And this is not necessarily a criticism of anybody who's of low socioeconomic status, but any person who automatically inherits a large sum of money or wins the lottery, the money ends up going really, really fast. I mean, my dad had a settlement once when he was nearly killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. That settlement money he blew through in a couple months. It's just that's the nature of inheriting large sums of money. And then my concern would be people would look at reparations and say, well, we did it. All right. It's taken care of. And it's like, well, for the reasons I just sort of explained, that's not going to be the end of the problem. Look, if you could maybe look into a situation where, okay, these schools that are predominantly African-American are just way lower funded, but that ties back into the property tax situation. Is that a way you could implement reparations? Maybe. So, I'm not fundamentally opposed to studying it, but I just can't envision a policy solution that would actually make any concrete sense and wouldn't lead to more racial strife.
Yeah, I think the biggest concern for me there is for sure the division that's going to be caused from something like that. And I'm sure I'm going to articulate this terribly, but as you're saying, like, how do you, like, moving forward from that, logistically, what even would it be?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, you would have, I imagine, the white family in West Virginia who makes $20,000 a year looking at Barack Obama's daughters getting reparation checks, and they would think, well, how, that just seems fundamentally unfair. And I feel like I'm getting treated like a second-class citizen. I think that if you want racial healing, that's maybe one of the worst solutions I could think of.
Yeah, I agree. That's tough. Moving on. We're keeping it going. Police brutality. Got to talk about it. My initial question is, I should say this. From what I've talked to with the older generation, they would almost say that the police brutality occurring back then was either just as prevalent or more so than it is now. Do you think it is as prevalent as the media is showing it to be?
I think it depends on what type of police brutality you mean. So if you're talking about, a unjustified police shooting, that probably seems to be happening more than it actually is. I mean, you have 1,000 police shootings that result in a death per year. A majority of those are probably justified. Plenty of them aren't. Probably more than we realize aren't. But I certainly don't know if it is necessarily worth the moral panic. With that being said, though, I do think that sort of the casual police roughing people up. I mean, I work at a public defender's office. I see cases where the police act completely unjustifiably and then lie in their reports about what they did. And it's not until, a video surfaces that it realizes, oh, gee, they weren't telling the truth. So, I think there's a real crisis right now in people's faith in police, because to what a lot of people think is they see something like what happened in Minneapolis with Chauvin, and George Floyd, and they think, my goodness, this is what the police are willing to do when they know they're being recorded. What are they doing when they're not being recorded? And it's a legitimate question. I mean, body cameras are not universal in this country, and they're a pretty recent invention. So, what we have right now is a really serious lack of trust in the police, an institution that used to be overwhelmingly trusted. And I think what that's combined with is a realization that there just isn't the type of accountability that we hope there would be. So you would like to think that there's this term called the blue wall of silence. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's just this idea that so it's this idea of when there's police misconduct, corruption, brutality, that a lot of the officers aren't willing to speak out or testify against the others. Classic example is what happened in Minneapolis. You had 3 people who probably knew it was wrong. One of them even kind of expressed that he felt uncomfortable, but he continued to hold them down. And so, Justin Amash, who's a congressman in Michigan, he made a comment that, if you have 1 cop who brutalizes somebody and 9 who sit there and watch, you have 10 bad cops. And so until I think you get to the point where people feel like they know the good cops, the cops who won't brutalize people, are willing to root out the corruption, it's going to be really hard to restore faith. I'll add one other point. I think what often gets glossed over as well is that police brutality is just one symptom of police corruption. It's one of the most obvious examples, one of the most horrifying examples when you see it. But there was a recent report in the LA Times that the Orange County Sheriff's Department, something like over 70% of the sheriffs there have at one point failed to book evidence on time and then lied about the reports because you're supposed to book it in the shift. Some of them held on to evidence as long as a year, even after the person was convicted, which creates huge problems in the chain of custody. So you have, situations like that I think people don't even realize are happening. So again, I think what happens is you have government institutions that there's a lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and in other government offices as well. But the police have some of the most power, and so it becomes one of the most dangerous when it's not held accountable and there's not transparency.
So you're saying that maybe we should implement more accountability? Do you think this defunding the police is a version of accountability? Well, what would your solution or what's progress forward in your eyes?
Well, I have to give a word first about defund the police.
Please do.
I often joke that I think that somebody in the Trump campaign infiltrated the Black Lives Matter movement and came up with a slogan, and it just kind of caught on because I couldn't think of a worse slogan. I mean, usually you have slogans that are meant to sort of broaden the tent, right? Think of something like abortion, right? Pro-life, pro-choice. Some people don't somebody who might think abortion should be legal in certain circumstances is still drawn to the label pro-life, right? It's a sort of broadening the tent. But defund the police just scares the heck out of every mom in suburban America. Now, with that being said, one of the things that's so crazy about it is if you look at there are some really fringe people who legit want to abolish the police, but some of the more moderate people who are using the slogan defund the police, you look at some of their solutions and you think, well, that's not the most unreasonable idea. Maybe somebody who's thinking about committing suicide, maybe it makes sense to send a mental health advocate rather than a guy with a gun and a taser that could escalate a situation. I think there's certainly merit to that argument. I mean, there was a case in Texas, a guy named Tony Timpa, who I can't remember his exact situation. Maybe he was intoxicated, but he called the police on himself because he wanted to get home okay. And it literally ended with a bunch of cops kneeling on his back, him suffocating, saying, "I can't breathe," and he died. And you think of a situation like that, and you're like, well, there's no reason for a cop responding to that. So some of the ideas, not all, I think some of the ideas are legitimate that we sort of maybe even many cops would agree that they're overburdened. They're expected to, any problem you have, you call the police. That's probably not a good culture, and it's probably not good for the cops, and it's often not good for the civilians. In terms of like, what does accountability look like? I think there's a few things. One is abolishing qualified immunity. Another is we need serious police union reform somehow or another. I mean, you have a situation where, like in Apple Valley, California, where a San Bernardino County sheriff beat the living daylights out of a guy who was subdued, and it was all caught by a helicopter camera. He was put on trial for felony assault, was convicted, and then the conviction was reversed on a technicality, but they could retry him. He ended up pleading guilty to a lesser misdemeanor charge, and then the union fought for him to get his job back. I mean, again, that's like a clear example of somebody looks at that and they don't think there's accountability. Another real problem is, and this is a little bit hard to change, you have sort of de facto jury immunity. So in my old city of Fullerton, there was a case where a homeless guy was savagely beaten to death by 6 police officers.
Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah,
Kelly Thomas, and I mean, he was tased multiple times. He screamed out, "Daddy, please help me! I can't breathe!"
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it just shocked everybody that he was acquitted. But I think that part of the problem is juries just don't like to second guess cops. I think part of the other problem, though, with so many of these cases resulting in acquittals, is the prosecutors intentionally or unintentionally, knowingly or unknowingly, botch the prosecutions. I mean, because a lot of times these prosecutors, they're friends with the cops, and then they end up prosecuting them. I think that in any case where a police officer is being prosecuted for committing a crime in their official duties, it should be automatically conflicted out of the DA office. You should go either to the state attorney general office, or you can outsource it to a private firm. And I think that would solve part of the problem. Again, these aren't all, none of these are going to solve it completely, but I think these are ways that you can at least restore confidence that there is going to be accountability.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the conflict of interest there is huge. Exactly what you're saying. I've heard some ideas of having non-government organizations do, what's the best word, almost like mental health audits as well within police departments, or like audits in general where they're not tied to the government. It's like just any sort of business, that's what they do in order to do it, to almost have this non-bias. But I mean, I guess bribery is a thing, but that's another solution we're considering.
No, I think that there is a serious point to be made that there isn't enough screening to begin with. Look, I know people who are compulsive liars that are now police officers, and it's kind of disturbing. That's just a whole other separate issue. But yeah, I think that there needs to be probably stronger mental health screening. I think that there's another point to be made that in several states, you need more hours of training to become a barber than to become a police officer. And people look at that. Look, in the military, the idea is you train for excellence, you pay excellently, you expect excellence. So, maybe there's Bernie Sanders, of all people, actually suggested that police should be paid more, but that you should expect more of them and that you should train them more. I don't know if that's the right solution, but I think that's certainly plausible.
Yeah. I think people would be willing to pay for a better service without a doubt. Most people are willing to put forth more dough if they're going to get more in return, and especially now, I feel like we're desperate for it. But like you're saying, that trust is there. But I'm sure people are going to be like, well, more money's going to go to. Well, why would we? I don't even trust them to begin with. So building trust again with the police department is going to be very interesting in the coming years. But I think at the very least, reform is going to come in one way or another. So
I hope so.
I hope so too. And I think the last little note I want to make on this is another thing that I think concerns me somewhat about a police officer's career is just the numbness, I'm sure, that happens. Like, I have a few friends that, are EMTs, and friends that are nurses who you see a death, and I'm sure the first few are traumatic, and then over time, like you find some sort of way of coping or callousing into where this is kind of like a normal thing. And I'm sure police as well fall into those habits where I'm now numb to this situation and this is how I do things. So something's got to break that line of habit.
Sure. Yeah.
Love it. All right, another topic. We're going to hit on affirmative action.
Oh. Good.
Yeah, what's your take on it?
Well, it's a very relevant question because I don't know if you heard this, but it's going to be on the California ballot. We're going to vote on whether or not to repeal the ban on affirmative action that was instituted in 1996 by voter referendum Proposition 209, which banned basically any preferential treatment at government schools or government businesses based on race, sex, religion, among other factors. Look, I think that this is definitely an issue that people of good faith can disagree on. My opinion tends to be that affirmative action doesn't usually help the people it purports to help. In many ways, might even hurt them. And I'll give you a few reasons why I think that. So, I had an interesting discussion with somebody I know who I work with who goes to Harvard. And we were talking about the financial aid at Harvard. And it turns out that in order to be disqualified from financial aid at Harvard, you have to make more than $300,000. Your family has to make more than $300,000 a year. So, your average American would qualify for financial aid at Harvard. Well, as it turns out, 60% of people at Harvard do not qualify for financial aid, which means you have 60% of the students that are not qualifying for financial aid. So I had an interesting conversation with a professor of mine who has done a lot of research on affirmative action. And what he said is what they found when there was a race-based affirmative action was the people who were ethnic minorities usually tended to be of a high socioeconomic class. So I think that the better solution is to have a sort of class-based socioeconomic affirmative action. And I think there's a few reasons why that makes sense. Well, first, so there's this idea out there this was actually a term coined by Professor Rick Sander. It's called mismatch theory. And the idea is that when you give somebody a substantial non-academic benefit, whether it's based off of being a racial minority, whether it's based off being an athlete, whether it's based off being a legacy student, that creates a situation where they're less likely to succeed. Because if you think about it, if GPA and SAT are supposed to be, and a lot of people, I guess this is taboo to say, but they actually tend to be pretty decent indicators of how you're going to perform in undergrad or law school. If somebody who is substantially below the mark, they're less likely to be able to keep up with their peers. And so, but if you have a sort of socioeconomic based affirmative action, imagine you have a situation where somebody does have that lower SAT or lower GPA, but their family made $25,000 a year and they were working two jobs that, they had this hardship and that hardship as a result of the community they grew up in. That to me is not a non-academic boost. It's recognizing that they probably would have done better, but for that socioeconomic disadvantage. So, my personal opinion is that, race-based affirmative action or sex-based affirmative action tends to only give benefits to ethnic minorities of a higher socioeconomic background, so the school can say, "Look, we're diverse," but there's less to help people of a lower socioeconomic status. And it creates a lot of difficult questions. I mean, there's no doubt that Arabs in this country have faced racial discrimination, especially after 9/11. But Arabs have to classify as white on most college applications, and so it just seems kind of strange that they wouldn't get any type of race-based affirmative action. But I would, because my last name is Rodriguez, even though I'm 1/4 Spanish and look about as white as you do, Nick. So I think there's this unfortunate myth that has been pushed that opposing affirmative action makes you racist. The irony of that is about 70% of African Americans oppose affirmative action. I think there was certainly a time when affirmative action was necessary in the 1960s. I think what you have now is a lot of people don't realize this, but like I said, there's kind of breaking up again. Okay, you're good.
I touched my ear. Go ahead.
Okay. So what you have now is like in the UCs and the CSUs, affirmative action is not allowed, but there's a perception by a lot of people that that ethnic minority, they just got there because of affirmative action. I think it actually sort of strips somebody of dignity when there's a perception that they were there because of affirmative action. And I want to be clear, even when somebody gets in because of a boost from affirmative action, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not qualified. I mean, if you have somebody who may have not gotten to Harvard if they weren't African American, they're still an exceptionally qualified student. So I think in any circumstance, it maybe creates a certain stigma. And like I said, with reparations, it might be creating sort of more racial tension than it purports to solve.
I've been trying to wrap my head around that as well, because I think very similar to you, I haven't heard about the socioeconomic style of affirmative action. So that's
which is what the UC and CSUs do. They have, so that professor Rick Sander, after Prop 209 passed, he was the one that pushed for a socioeconomic affirmative action.
Because I do think, like, with the college example, it should be performative base. And as you're saying, like, if somebody was in a circumstance where they performed decently well and they had all these other things going on, even if you could say extracurriculars that could count toward that, I think that still is a performative measure that you could say this is what makes you qualified.
Yep.
And then I also agree with your point, and I feel like there's something there that I'm like trying to grasp onto, is like, if affirmative action, a minority gets into college, like, will they be thinking this is why I got in, because of I am this looking or whatever it is? And as you're saying, it kind of strips from the, like, did I earn it kind of deal. And I think that's the part that I'm sitting on, where I don't sit right with affirmative action.
Sure. I'll give you a very famous example, but then I'll give you a counterexample to it. So Clarence Thomas, he's the second African American on the Supreme Court. He's currently on the Supreme Court, was appointed by George H.W. Bush. He went to Yale Law School. And he says that he doesn't even have his Yale Law degree displayed because he feels like he just got in because of affirmative action. He sort of feels ashamed. Now, there's another person on the court, Justice Sotomayor, who's the first Latina Supreme Court justice, and now she feels the complete opposite as Clarence Thomas, and thinks, well, I had all these disadvantages, and I wouldn't have been able to be where I am without a little bit of a boost. And so so the opinion I subscribe that maybe some minorities might feel, this is not me postulating on how any feels, but I'm saying that there's an example of Clarence Thomas and Sotomayor. They have maybe both had the same benefit from it, but have walked away feeling completely different about it. It's a very difficult issue. I don't think that there's a clear answer on it. I think that people of good faith disagree on it, but we'll see how the California voters decide in November.
How they feel about it. Yeah, that's one I'm definitely still brewing on, and I'm kind of with you. Of there's no one way that's gonna take the cake on it. But are you ready for the next one? You ready for the next topic?
Oh, absolutely.
We're in the midst of a pandemic here, and COVID-19 has rapidly turned into a political game. How has it turned into a political game? How did you see that form? Why is it this way? Like, what about it?
Yeah, look, I think there is this perception among a lot of conservatives in America that everything was going really, really well until about March of 2020. The economy was doing well. If you ask most people, they would say that things were better than they were 4 years ago. Trump looked like he was in a solid path to re-election. And with the pandemic, the stock market started crashing, and people's lives got noticeably worse. And so I think there's been this sort of, and then you had all of Trump's press conferences, and now there's just been kind of the strategy of not even addressing it. So it sort of has turned into a political game, lockdowns, face masks, etc. And whereas I think, on the Democrat side, they see a clear vulnerability and rightly or wrongly have exploited it. I think that's why the COVID in general is a political issue. I think like issues like a lockdown, those are, that's a very difficult issue. Face masks, I truly struggle to see why anybody is comparing that to fascism. A lot of people like my parents' age, they're Gen Xers. They will, I think in many cases, justifiably criticize millennials and Gen Zers for being snowflakes and being entitled. They hate the Trump Hitler comparisons, rightfully so. And then a lot of people, the Gen Xers, will go on to compare face masks to fascism and one step away from Nazi Germany. And it's like, well, wait a second, that's exactly what you were criticizing the other generation for. To me, I don't think wearing a face mask during the midst of a global pandemic is any more intrusive than having to wear clothes. In fact, in 1918, during the Spanish flu, it was considered an act of patriotism to wear a face mask. The government ran ads basically like, this is your civic duty. This is your American duty. And I think that we would all benefit if that is how people treated the pandemic as a chance for everybody to come together, not trafficking in conspiracy theories that Bill Gates is using COVID to develop a vaccine, implant chips in you. Yeah, I mean, I have to tell people that. I'm like, you really think you're that important that Bill Gates cares about you and wants to track you? But
so how would you say, I mean, we're touching on the line here. How do you think the government has mismanaged this pandemic? And you know what, if you want to throw some good in there too, what good do you think too? If any.
So I'll start off with some bipartisan criticism. So I think something that did a immeasurable amount of damage to American confidence in their government was about I think it was the end of February. The Surgeon General. I'm gonna read exactly what he said. I think I have it here. Maybe I don't have it. But so anyways, he basically said though that not to wear face masks, that they don't work, that really the healthcare workers needed them, and then now we know that the science that's not what the science shows. Maybe they had a altruistic motive of preserving those for the people who needed them most, but I mean, our government just flat out lied to us, and maybe they stopped creating a panic of people being buying face masks in mass, but people could have had sort of makeshift face masks that could have resulted in a reduction of COVID spreading. Okay, so that's one just pathetic example of mismanagement. Pathetic example two. So that is somebody affiliated with the current administration. You have somebody like New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who for the life of me I can't understand why he's getting as much praise as he is. He had a rule early on that required nursing homes to take elderly COVID patients, and then it would just spread like a wildfire in these nursing homes, and then would kill a significant number of people in the nursing homes.
Ooh.
Yeah, no, not good. You have New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, who there's a joke that whether you're conservative, whether you're progressive in New York, everybody's united in their hatred for Bill de Blasio. But Bill de Blasio in late February was encouraging people to go out and party in Chinatown because you don't want people to harbor these horrible views of Chinese people, and I guess so it made sense to gather during it on the verge of pandemic. New York got a lot of warnings, and they just didn't lock down soon enough. Which was you can debate the merits of a lockdown, but in a city where people are using mass public transit, where it's so easy to spread, it really was important for them to lock down early on. Now, then, on the other hand, you have, I think, with the current president, he's kind of decided that he just doesn't want to dress. He wants to pretend like COVID didn't happen. He had a rally during a pandemic, which is insane. I mean, it wasn't even outside. It was inside, no face mask required. It turned out that one of the attendees, Herman Cain, had COVID and wasn't wearing a mask. He's, I think, hospitalized right now. He retweeted something recently where he basically said that like everything you've been told about COVID is a lie. I think back in early January, he retweeted something from One American News claiming that Johnson & Johnson invented the coronavirus. And so it's just, I think it's very, I mean, I think there's an abysmal number, like only 30% of the country, maybe even less than that, trusts Trump on information regarding COVID-19. So, I mean, that is going to horribly shake the public's faith that this is being properly managed. In terms of praise, I think there have been some, I think Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio, who's a Republican, Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, also Republican. I think they both have sort of shown leadership. It really is amazing to see which governors have seen their approval ratings go up and which have seen them go down. And I think people that, I mean, the policy questions are very difficult, but if people just get this perception that they're taking it seriously, by wearing a mask in public, by encouraging people to be cautious, by not being overly dismissive of it, that goes a long way in reassuring faith. I think Larry Hogan, too, his wife is South Korean. He was able to procure like 1 million tests. I mean, when your leader is being that proactive, again, it goes a long way in restoring the public's trust. So, on the local side, I think you've seen some better responses. It cuts both ways.
Yeah, if your leadership is stepping up to the plate and saying, "Hey, let's all take this a little seriously," strong leadership helps for sure.
It does, and I just think that so many people, I know some people who voted for Trump in 2016 and were leaning towards him, and then they started watching every night of the COVID press briefs, and they just felt like the guy wasn't taking things seriously, and are really second questioning that decision now to vote for him again in 2020. I mean, it just, if you watch I watched a few of them, and it just didn't seem like he was taking them seriously. He would spend some of the time talking sleepy Joe Biden, and just didn't, I think, to a lot of people, feel like serious leadership. And I would contrast that. I think like somebody like Mike Pence, whenever somebody like Mike Pence spoke, people felt a little bit more reassured. So, it's not necessarily an anti-Republican Party thing. I think it's particularly the personality of President Trump.
Yeah, and I think his take on the tests are very odd. Come on, man.
it was one of the worst lines I think I ever saw. I watched the entire Tulsa, Oklahoma rally. My first time ever watching a rally of his, at least the full thing. And, my mom was kind of on the table, just kind of doing budgeting. And all of a sudden she hears Trump say, I told them to slow the testing down because the numbers would look really bad. She turns around and she goes, what did he just say? My mom's the most apolitical person, and she was just horrified. And then there was a statement going, no, he was just joking. And I thought to myself, it didn't sound like he was joking, but whatever. He probably was. Then he starts going on Twitter and saying, we should have slowed the testing, or I told them to slow the testing down. It's like he's just doubling down on this. And again, though, that is a clear example, even if he's joking, which I hope he is, it's just an example of not very serious leadership.
Yeah, and the math of like, if we just did less testing, the numbers would be smaller, guys. Come on.
Right. But I think I think Trump's problem right now is he sees COVID-19 as a Trump 2020 problem, and not as an American problem. He sees it as his biggest threat to getting reelected, to his biggest threat to his approval ratings, which have just been abysmal lately. And so it's very hard for him to sort of refocus. It's all about him. It's all about, this is all an attack on him. If we would just slow the numbers down, it wouldn't look as bad for him. And because he's sort of so self-obsessed, I think it's really affected his ability to effectively respond.
Yeah, and lead. But that's a whole discussion on leadership right there for you. You take the stance of you're against shutting down the state, correct, of California?
Yes.
What's your take?
Yeah, so I think you have to weigh the benefits gained versus the burdens imposed. And look, I think there's certain areas that I saw that bars are more dangerous for spreading COVID than concerts. If that's true, I certainly think that closing down bars might be justified. But a full-scale shutdown has tremendous economic burdens, especially on small businesses, which, there was a chief medical trauma expert at a hospital in the Bay Area who said he has seen more suicide attempts in 4 weeks than he typically sees in a year. People have, I would imagine, depression at much higher rates, anxiety at much higher rates. So there's, a very, very serious burden that's imposed. And so then the question is, well, what is the benefit gained? And it turns out from everything I've read, masks are pretty effective. If both people are wearing a mask, the chance of a transmission is like 1% of what it normally might be. Now, of course, you have a problem where not everybody wants, I've just seen video after video of people whining and complaining about masks being 2 steps away from the Third Reich. Obviously, that's silly. I think if you put real meat, I was very skeptical of actually enforcing a mask requirement. I've gotten to the point where I'm realizing that the anti-maskers might be what's preventing a full or at least a large reopening. And so I think if you had a real meat to a masking requirement, like a $300 fine or something, then you could essentially pressure people to wearing the mask, and then you could more safely reopen. But I just think that the burdens, whether it's from suicide attempts, whether it's from economic depression, the UN predicted that economic downturn could result in hundreds of thousands of children starving. There's a lot of serious negative effects this can have, and I'm just not convinced that that 1% of transmission based off both people wearing a mask is worth the full-scale shutting down. Now, you get to a little bit more tricky situations when you talk about something like schools, which truly has to be a local-based decision. But in something like that, kids riding in a bus together, packed in the classroom together, eating, and then going home to their parents. I think that's a much trickier issue, and I haven't fully decided how I feel about that, but I'm kind of a skeptic that, at least in more urban areas, that the schools should reopen. But it's truly something that I think should be a local-based decision, which is why I think it's kind of silly that the president is threatening revoking federal funding from any schools that aren't. Look, the approach that a school in rural Nebraska or even in Southern California, where they could probably hold classes outside, is going to be remarkably different than what a school in New York City does.
Yeah, especially during the winter. Come on now.
Right.
What would you say for the universities then? Do you think that's in the same kind of category, or it would be different because we're not picking each other's boogers in the classroom, and kids' ability to wear a mask is, granted. I mean, we could talk about like how, does COVID affect children under the age of 14 and all that stuff, but still, as you're saying, the spread is still continuous. But with universities, hit the same mark because you're living it, right?
Yeah, I exactly. I tend to be a little bit more in favor of reopening the universities. At a minimum, what you have to do is the priority has to be given to people who have to be there, right? Whether it's medical school students who just aren't going to get the same benefit from online learning, dental school students, people who are engineering, people who are chemistry, things like that. That should be given the priority. I understand you can't have 40,000 people at a university. I mean, that's probably not a good idea either. But yeah, you can certainly have like a significant reopening with a lot of precautionary measures. Maybe you have smaller class sizes, and that's why you might not have a full-on reopening. Maybe it has to be at 50% capacity, so half of classes are online or something like that. To me, that's probably the best way to approach it. Again, though, it's one of those that is going to have to be, I think, university by university. UC Merced, which is in a much more rural area, can probably take a little different approach than somewhere like UCLA where I go, or UC Berkeley, which is in a much more urban area. So again, I think that's part of the problem is there's been very much an idea that you either are for locking down the state or reopening the state, or locking down or keeping the schools closed or not. Again, I think that these are decisions that have to be made locally, and there's going to be based on different concerns, different outcomes.
What do you see the long-term effects being if we continue? I mean, because we just closed down yesterday, right? It was literally, Newsom just said, let's close this thing down. What do you think the long-term effects are going to be if we continue to keep our state closed?
Yeah, I mean, California's economy is very volatile. It does well when the country does really well because it largely relies on higher taxes for higher income people, and we have a lot of those people in the state. Well, when the economy does really well, California does really poorly, or when the country doesn't do well, California does poorly. And when the state economy is closed, the state's going to really struggle. I mean, we went from having a projected surplus to a deficit. And like I said, just from mental health issues to, I think, physical health issues, people are getting less exercise with gyms being closed. I just don't think that the marginal benefit of maybe marginally reducing the COVID transmission rate is worth the burden it's going to ultimately oppose. So I don't know. I don't know what is our standard for reopening. I mean, is it no cases? Is it a vaccine? I mean, that could take years. Certainly, that's not the approach. So, and there hasn't been a clearly articulated standard, I think, on when we should reopen. And again, I think that's why a lot of people are probably worried, concerned, but
yeah, we have no objective, no goal as a state to say, hey, when we hit this benchmark, we're gonna have it. Don't you guys want to have that incentive of being able to go outside again? It's kind of like, hey man, we're shutting down, and I hope you could just survive until I say you're good again.
Right. And look, I partly I mean, look, if there was a way, I was having this conversation with somebody earlier today, like New Zealand, they're at 0 cases, or it's essentially 0 cases. And they really did do a full-scale lockdown. The problem is it's such a patchwork solution here where I was kind of mentioning different localities doing different things, which I do think makes sense. But when people are traveling maybe from urban areas to more rural areas, I mean, it's almost like it keeps on persisting. So it's like, man, maybe if you gave everybody like a 2-week window to say, all right, you got to stock up, and then we're just going to lock down for like 3 weeks. I don't know, maybe that would do something. But, clearly this pandemic completely caught us off guard. And my only hope is that COVID is obviously, a terrible virus, but it could be much worse. And my hope would be when COVID 2.0 comes, that we'll be much better prepared.
Yeah, we'll be able to say, this is the tail end when we handled it well. These are the good takeaways where we can actually implement in the next one to go forward and not be so blindsided. But I think we nailed down COVID. We're going on to a topic that I think you like it, or I think you're going to be interested on it. Cancel culture.
Sure.
Oh man. Oh, cancel culture.
Boy. Yeah.
Hit me.
All right. Okay. And see, part of the problem is there's like, I think when people say cancel culture, a lot of people mean different things. I mean, is it cancel culture to stop having Jefferson Davis's statue at the Kentucky State Capitol when Kentucky wasn't even part of the Confederacy? No, I don't think so. And there's certain, I think the difficulty is defining the contours of what is sort of speech that somebody just doesn't deserve to stay hired for making, but versus what is legitimate open debate. So I don't think there was a situation where one of Tucker Carlson's writers turned out to be like and posting like horrible, like sexist. I think he was an incel,
Right.
all this other stuff. And I never saw anybody getting outraged that he was getting fired. But to give a counterexample, there was this Harper's letter where a lot of mostly center left to sometimes very hard left people and some center right people all signed on this letter basically saying we want open debate and open discourse. And, sometimes people are going to say the wrong thing, but maybe we shouldn't maybe we should sometimes show them redemption. I mean, you had everybody from David Frum, who is a member of the George W. Bush administration, to Noam Chomsky, who's maybe one of the most left-wing people I could describe in the American political world, both signing on to this letter. Well, so there was this guy, Matt Iglesias, who is part of Vox. And one of the employees at Vox basically sent a letter to the editors saying, Matt Iglesias signing on this letter makes me feel unsafe in my work environment. And Matt Iglesias is he's a pretty left-wing individual. And she later claimed, I wasn't trying to get him fired. Well, what does saying he makes me feel unsafe in the workplace mean? I mean, most contexts that seems get rid of him. Yeah. So I think you definitely have a situation where people are, making things taboo that probably shouldn't be taboo, and they're turning things that might be a place for legitimate discourse and strangling that out. It's genuinely alarming. It's something that you've seen on college campuses for at least the past 7 years, and it's sort of made its way into the mainstream. Maybe as all these people are graduating from Berkeley and becoming part of news media, it's becoming more of the mainstream, but it's definitely alarming. I've talked to people who, for example, on the issues of race in America, who are genuinely alarmed by what they see happening in Minneapolis, what they saw with Officer Chauvin, but they're just terrified to speak out because they don't want to say the wrong thing. And it doesn't help when you get these messages of like, silence is violence, but know your place, don't take up too much space. And like, people are they don't know how to respond. And, at a minimum, you got to show people a little bit more redemption and grace.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and touching on the race thing, like the almost like the idea that if you don't post this black square on this Tuesday, you're
right.
racist, and we're gonna call you out racist. Like you're in a place of influence, and you didn't post that photo. We gotta cancel you. Like
right. Well, there's this great, and when I say great, I mean it's probably one of the worst books written. I'm only about halfway through at this point, but it's by Robin DiAngelo. It's called White Fragility. And part of it, there's this built-in idea that if you take issue with anything that she's saying, it's just another example of your white fragility. But she has these like absurd ideas. Like apparently she has literally this chapter called White Tears. And she talks about how she discourages white women from crying for minorities because it triggers these painful memories about, white tears resulting in like something like Emmett Till being hung or, and beaten. So there's just these like generally alarming, she talks about how she strives to be less white. She sort of has these almost like white identitarian ideas that like white people have this collective experience, collective interests. But then she kind of turns it into like being about anti-racism, but I could very easily how somebody could sympathize with some of these white identitarian ideas. And they just basically become an alt-righter. So, I'm watching people recommend all over this book, but I don't know if they've actually read it because it's one of the most unnuanced books I've ever read. Somebody compared it to the worst book they've read since Art of the Deal, and I think that's probably right.
Oh man,
he has about as much nuance as Trump too. So it's either racist or anti-racist, amazing or sad.
Yeah, so. I mean, you're either this or you're that, and it's tough because you and I are both talking and we're both white men in this discussion. Sure. So kind of what you're saying of how much opinion can you have when in fact it's like this discussion where everybody is involved and trying to find a solution for these issues
Right.
on race, but with this added flavor of cancel culture of, okay, you have an opinion and you're trying to create this healthy dialogue, but
Right.
we're gonna find the little details within your opinion to just obliterate you. And that's the scary part, is I think it's hindering all sorts of healthy conversations in general, you know?
No, absolutely. And look, I think there's certainly merit to the argument that, I will never know what it's like to be Black in America. I walk in my suburban neighborhood at 10 o'clock at night sometimes, and I've never had somebody call the police on me. And if I was Black, I'm sure at least one person in my entire neighborhood might call the police. And so there's some real merit to that. And I think like the idea now is that you should try to empathize, try to listen, and that's all good. I'm seeing, though, like you said, these sort of bad faith actors in cancel culture who, you say the wrong thing or you're not sure how to express it, and I mean, immediately they impugn a bad motive, and I don't know if that's true. And then I see like bad actors on the other side who are like, they rather than share their own opinion, they are having Candace Owens do their dirty work, and I think Candace Owens is like the very definition of a grifter. She said some horrible things about George Floyd, but she sort of has the shield of being Black herself, and it's just kind of, I think, an intellectually lazy way for some white people to not say anything and to just have Candace Owens say what they're thinking. Everybody sucks right now.
Everybody, yeah, that's true. That's very true. The other thing that I'm almost afraid of with cancel culture is like, so let's say, I don't know. I don't want to use the word. Yeah, let's do it. This might be a terrible example, but I'm going to go for it.
Okay, go for it.
Let's say somebody who is white makes an opinion and trying to start a discussion in some way, and they get canceled for it. And let's say they had a part of them that was racist to begin with. I'm afraid that if they were canceled in a way where they had any inclination to just try to figure out maybe I am part of the problem, they're like, okay, nope, the other side's the problem, and now I am even more racist than I was before because I just got canceled to have an opinion. And vice versa. It could go either way,
One of the stated reasons that Obama didn't use the term radical Islam is he was worried that it would push a lot of sort of moderate Muslims into feeling alienated. Well, if that's true, I'd have to think that having this sort of broadening the tent of who's a white supremacist has got to push some people to that other camp. I think a maybe better example, and this is maybe a little bit more disconnected from cancel culture, but in terms of the people who I think are genuinely grappling with these issues and maybe are skeptics of systemic racism, but might be open to having their minds changed. And then when the issues kind of become focused on, removing the episode of the Golden Girls that had somebody had mud face on,
Betty White,
or like, or like Aunt Jemima, or these other issues, people look at it and they go, what? That's what you're upset about? Oh, okay, we don't have anything to worry about. Rather than these much more complicated issues that I talked about earlier, like de facto housing and school education, and it's just. And so some of those are examples of cancel culture when we get obsessed over Matt Iglesias signing on to a letter of open discourse. Again, it's like people look at them and they go, really, that's your example of systemic racism? And they're screaming, no, that's not it. That's not the example. So I think you end up just turning a lot of people off who maybe you're not pushing them to being racist, but you are pushing them off into maybe wanting to be part of a solution to end some of the problems I outlined earlier.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Man, Luke, is there any other topics that you want to hit before we settle in?
I think I covered everything that's on my mind for now.
Love it. Yeah, I think that there's so many topics that I feel like I could continue to pick your brain on, and some are already stirring up. There's a saying that I don't think we should discuss it yet, just because I don't know enough about it. And I mean, granted, I don't think I knew enough about a lot of the stuff we discussed about today, but the "eat the rich" saying and all of those types of things, I think you may deserve a part 2 on this, Luke, because this was definitely a fascinating discussion for sure.
Well, we are in one of the most fascinating years. The year started off with a near war with Iran. We went then to an impeachment. So it was a repeat of the 1990s, and then unfortunately did not succeed, in my opinion. It was unfortunate that it didn't succeed because now we have an inept leader leading to a global pandemic, and then we have urban unrest. It's a wild, and we haven't even gotten to the election in November, so it is going to be a wild year.
It really is. Maybe as the election gets brewing up again, we'll bring you on and you can chop it up.
Yeah. Well, maybe after the debates, we'll talk about the word. We'll try to consume the word salad. So.
Yeah, exactly. Luke, where can we find you on the internet?
My Twitter is @LukeRodriguez75. Instagram is @LukeRodriguez98.
Love it. Definitely. I feel like you deserve 100% a follow on Twitter because you're active. We get to see what's going on, and it's very informative.
I think I have some pretty idiosyncratic takes too. It's not one sided. So yeah, honestly, maybe people will be enlightened or disturbed or pissed off one way or the other. So you're
gonna get something, that's true. Well, I honestly, for me, like when I see your tweets, like it is informing to me because I don't know. I'm probably an individual that wants to learn more about the side of politics that is just like scraping the edge of where I'm finally getting deeper and deeper. And I think your tweets help a lot with my education, my learning on this side of the world. So to everybody listening, highly recommend give Luke a follow.
I mean, Twitter is generally a dumpster fire, so I think that's the highest compliment you could pay to a Twitter account. So I appreciate it.
You got it, Luke. Thank you for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye. I'm not.
Bye.
Bye.
That was the episode. You just listened to it, so I don't need to tell you how it went. Obviously, it was great. Next week on the podcast, guest Drew Talbert. He teaches at the Groundlings. He's got over 150,000 followers on TikTok, and also an unbelievable story of persistence and determination. You'll love to see it. Uploads every Friday at 6 a.m., so grab your cup of joe and wake up and listen, or sleep in and listen to it after. But on Friday, it's going to be there 6 a.m., so set your alarm. The real reason you're still here: how does a penguin build its house? Igloos together. I'll let you think about that one for a second. So, we're grateful you're here. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you for being the best darn supporters.